The subcommittee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up H.R. 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Duncan, which incorporates changes from both sides of the aisle and was provided to your offices earlier this week and posted on the committee website, will be considered base text for purposes of this markup. The clerk will report the base text.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3783, offered by Mr. Duncan of South Carolina.
Without objection, the text is considered read and is open for amendment at any point. And before proceeding to the ranking member and any other members seeking recognition, I recognize myself for a brief statement on the measure before us. In recent years, Iran has developed close ties with several leaders in the Western Hemisphere who share its violent anti-Americanism, and most recently, Iranian President Ahmadinejad undertook his 6th visit to the hemisphere, undertaking what some of the press quipped a tyrant's tour of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Ecuador. The growing Iranian role in the Western Hemisphere has been the subject of several committee hearings and classified briefings. Many members are concerned, however, that the administration has not adequately examined or sought to counter Iran's growing and hostile diplomatic and intelligence presence in our hemisphere. Let's be clear, the Iranian threat isn't just thousands of miles away, it is close to home. Back in the 1990s, Iran was behind the bombings in Argentina. More recently, Hezbollah operatives have penetrated our borders. The Iranian attempt to assassinate the Saudi ambassador on U.S. soil using a Mexican drug cartel is the latest demonstration of this threat. Indeed, recently testifying before Congress, the Director of National Intelligence stated that Iranian officials have, I'll give his quote here, have changed their calculus and are now willing to conduct an attack in the United States, unquote. The DNI went on to say that the Iranians are, quote, trying to penetrate and engage in this hemisphere. Besides a potential platform to conduct terrorist attacks, some experts see other sources of motivation for closer Iranian links to the hemisphere. Many believe that the countries Iran is courting in the Western Hemisphere can help them circumvent sanctions. Testifying before Congress recently, one former U.S. official noted, quote, the dangerous activities of Iran and Hezbollah so near our borders demand a whole-of-government strategy beginning with an interagency review to understand and assess the transnational, multifaceted nature of this problem and to mobilize friendly governments to respond, unquote. This bill, H.R. 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012, authored by our colleague Mr. Duncan of South Carolina and Mr. Higgins of New York, two members of the subcommittee, requires such a review and strategy and basically would kick the bureaucracy into gear. With 60 co-sponsors, including myself, it deserves support, and I urge its passage. I'll remind the members of the committee that we will very soon have the last votes of this day on the floor, so brevity is appreciated, and without objection, all members can submit their full statements for the record. I now recognize from the other side the member from Rhode Island for any remarks he may have before I turn to the legislation's author.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too am concerned, I think, as most Americans, about the growing influence of Iran in the Western Hemisphere, and I think this is an issue which the President and the administration are taking very seriously and remain fully engaged in as they monitor these events and confront the growing threat of Iran around the world. And I think this legislation, of course, begins with an assessment by the Secretary of this threat, which I think is an important step, and I support the legislation, and thank you for the opportunity to make some opening comments.
I thank the gentleman from Rhode Island. Are there any other members who wish to strike the last word and speak on this measure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and ask that my statement be submitted in its entirety into the record.
That was brief. I think we're going to hold the vote open for a few minutes for our ranking member. I'm going to allow Mr. Duncan, the author of the measure, then to go ahead with the statement that he has submitted for the record. If you want to elaborate on that at this moment,
I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Sherman and Mr. Sisseline from Rhode Island, I want to start by thanking you and your staff for the assistance on this legislation. I appreciate the bipartisan cooperation on the bill. Today, we have 63 members who have co-sponsored it. And as you all know, this bill offers us an opportunity to work together with our allies and partners in the Western Hemisphere to identify the mutual threats to our interest and to act together to protect those interests. And just of note, I met with the ambassador of Mexico to further that conversation and make sure that we all understand that this is our neighborhood and that we're working for mutual protection of our interest. And today, one of the most subversive threats facing the U.S. and our neighbors comes from Iran's hostile activity and strategic influence in our hemisphere. The U.S. has vital political, economic, and security interest in the Western Hemisphere, and Iran's penetration into the region represents a threat to the U.S. as well as the rest of the hemisphere. Today, Iran has nearly doubled its number of embassies in the region from 6 to 11, and President Ahmadinejad has also recently completed his 6th visit to the region. While Iran, as a sovereign country, does have the right to engage in public diplomacy when its actions are hostile to American interest and incite anti-American views among our neighbors, and when it seeks to use its influence to evade U.S. and international sanctions, we need to take notice, and we need to respond accordingly. Today, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps elite Quds Force stations operatives in foreign embassies, charities, religious and cultural institutions to build relationships with local population. As the chairman mentioned, Hezbollah, considered by the U.S. State Department as the most technically capable terrorist group in the world, tends to use cells that contain a recruitment entity, fundraising entity, and operational entity. While Hezbollah cells may focus primarily on only on fundraising, in all cases, each Hezbollah operative has an operational mandate. In Mexico, we've seen evidence of Hezbollah's activity. The full Iranian plot just of this last June, revealed by the administration publicly in October, is a prime example. The Univision documentary that was released in December on the Iranian threat, the established nexus between narco-trafficking and terrorism, and sophisticated narco-tunneling discovered along the U.S.-Mexico border provide credible evidence for a concern that possible terrorist networks are engaging in our hemisphere, and maybe evidence that Mexican drug trafficking organizations are tapping into Hezbollah's expertise in order to better transport drugs, people, and who knows what into the United States of America. We have also reason to suspect Iran has sought influence through Hezbollah in Canada. Most recently, the U.S. DEA and Treasury Department's success in effectively shutting down the Lebanese-Canadian Bank raises question on Iran's actions in Canada because the Lebanese-Canadian Bank, formerly a subsidiary of the Royal Bank of Canada, also had offices in Montreal. Today, many experts believe that Hezbollah is better established in North America and in the United States than any other terrorist organization in the world. With the connection between drugs, money, and terrorism, we have to wonder how many of these designated drug trafficking organizations are working with Hezbollah and other Arab networks here within the United States. Now, Congress has authorized trillions of dollars for military operations in the global war on terror in the last decade. Yet Iran has steadily been establishing a presence here in our own neighborhood from which it can exercise influence. What are we doing about it? Overestimating the threat does not serve the American people well, but underestimating the threat could bring great harm to the American people, to our friends in the region, and to U.S. assets, and to our allies here and abroad. So I believe this bill is necessary as a first step to redoubling our efforts to better understand the extent of the Iranian activity here at home by establishing a strong U.S. relationship with our neighbors. It requires an assessment of the threat and a strategy to counter Iran's hostile actions that protects the U.S. interest and the assets in the Western Hemisphere, addresses U.S. vital energy security interests, and calls for a secure U.S. border to prevent Iranian operatives from entering the United States. Just last month, the director of the DNI, James Clapper, testified that Iranian officials are, quote, more willing to conduct an attack in the United States in response to real or perceived U.S. actions that threaten the regime, period, unquote. We need to be prepared with a strategy to counter Iran's hostile presence in our neighborhood, and I ask my colleagues to, and I encourage you to please support the bill, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Your point about every agent having an operational mandate is a correct one. From our experience, and I would just cite the example of Mahmoud Karani, who successfully infiltrated our country over our southern border in the state of California. It was done through a process whereby he was put in the trunk of a car, brought into this country, reached the Midwest before it was discovered that he and a host of fellow Iranian-trained agents were here, over 50 in total. And here's what was interesting about the training. It wasn't just, as you mentioned, in fundraising. It was also in weapons training. It was also in explosives. It was in intelligence. It was the full range of how to sow terror. And what's equally interesting to me is that his brother was General Karani. General Karani was in charge of the bombardment during the Israel-Hezbollah war. And I was up in Haifa in '06 when it was coming under attack. And I saw the effectiveness of these Hezbollah operatives as they were working, you know, these missiles that had been given to them by Iranian and Syrian forces. And the thought that the brother of that individual was able to go into a consulate in Beirut and pay a $5,000 bribe, in this case to an official from Mexico, in order to get the phony documentation to go into Mexico, and then would link up with one of these cartels that move people through the border in order to get through our southern border. And the fact that we wouldn't find him until I think he was up in Detroit when he was finally apprehended. Of course, he and these other individuals subsequently were convicted. But it shows the necessity of having this legislation, and I'm going to turn to the gentleman of Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for any remarks he might want to make.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, first of all, my colleague from South Carolina for offering 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012. This is a very, very important piece of legislation. We've seen increasing evidence. We've known it for a long time, but it's becoming increasingly evident to the rest of the world, certainly to the American people, of Iran's intentions to negatively impact the freedoms and the liberties that we enjoy here in America. And so I stand in full support of this piece of legislation, and I again want to thank my colleague for introducing it.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio. Hearing no further requests to speak, are there any amendments? Hearing no further amendments, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the bill as amendment will be reported favorably to the full committee in the form of a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. And the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming amendments. We're not going to adjourn because our ranking member, I believe, wanted to say a few remarks, make a few brief remarks on this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is so important that I thought my opportunity to pontificate on it was less important than moving it as quickly as possible. As you know, you wanted to schedule this hearing at a time when I couldn't be here right on time.
However, without objection,
I made it in time to
you did.
commend you for your decision to schedule the meeting at a time when we could move this bill.
If I could interrupt, without objection, I'd like to move for a revote At the same time, I'm going to yield to the ranking member for his opening statement. All right.
You have a vote, please.
Mr. Sherman, we're fine. We've got over 10 minutes before the clock.
His indulgence. I've long advocated the strongest possible sanctions on Iran due to its terrorism. Perhaps the greatest example of the worldwide ambitions of Iran took place in the early 1990s when they attacked the Israeli embassy in Argentina and the Jewish Cultural Center there as well. But just recently, Iranian agents planned to kill a Saudi ambassador on U.S. soil. This demonstrates that Iran is not content to make mischief in the old world. They have come to our hemisphere as well. I believe the strongest possible sanctions and the maximum possible diplomatic isolation of Iran. That's why I'm glad that just yesterday Ben Bernanke said that he would use his voice and vote to and supervisorial role over the SWIFT system to prevent Iranian banks from conducting business with banks around the world, providing he had a clear indication from those concerned with national security that that was indeed a good U.S. policy. And then in this room, just yesterday, Secretary Clinton, in response to my question, said, yes, indeed, that would be a furtherance of U.S. policy. I'm currently, okay, we need the strongest possible sanctions. Last year I introduced the Stop Iran Nuclear Weapons Program Act, much of which has been included in legislation passed by the House, the Iran Threat Reduction Act. The legislation will hopefully be the subject of a conference once the Senate passes its version. The Iran Threat Reduction Act includes the toughest sanctions yet on the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force, and these are among the provisions I authored. I am currently compiling provisions that didn't make it into ITRA, along with other provisions in a new package, which I'll introduce soon. My goal is to keep introducing the strongest possible sanctions bills against Iran until that government changes its policy. Since 2003, I've worked with Chairman Royce on this subcommittee, where we have focused on so many issues of proliferation. I'm perhaps more concerned about those impending votes that our chairman, so I'll put the rest of the statement in the record and thank him for his decision to revote our action here.
Well, I thank the ranking member, and without objection, we will void the prior vote and consider the question de novo. The question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the bill, as amended, will be reported favorably to the full committee in the form of a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming amendments. That concludes our business. The subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
We filibustered, but it took a little encouragement to get the filibuster.